The alarm clock broke a year ago. Caleb Morrison hadn't bothered to replace it. His body didn't need one anymore. Every morning at 4:45 a.m., something inside his chest clicked on like a switch, like a mechanism that had been wound tight the night before, now releasing its tension into the darkness. His eyes opened to the same cracked ceiling, the same hairline fracture that ran from the corner like a scar that wouldn't heal, the same strip of pale light that leaked through the curtain where the rod had loosened months ago. He kept meaning to fix it, but he never did, because the imperfection served a purpose. It reminded him that some things didn't need fixing, they just needed accepting. He lay there for exactly 3 breaths, measured, controlled, the way he did everything now. Then he got up. The floor groaned under his weight as he moved through the narrow hallway toward the kitchen. The house was small, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom with a faucet that dripped no matter how many times he fixed it. A kitchen where the counter tilted slightly to the left, a flaw in the house's bones that had shifted over the years. But it was clean, every surface wiped down, every dish put away, every corner organized in a way that suggested someone had taken absolute control over the few things in life that could be controlled. That someone was Caleb Morrison, 42 years old, black, a man who worked at the lumber mill on the edge of town and lived as if he was constantly preparing for something, though he would never admit what. He cracked 2 eggs into a cast iron pan. They sizzled the moment they hit the heat. The whites began to set, immediately turning from translucent to solid white in the span of seconds. He sliced a piece of bread, whole wheat, the cheaper kind that stuck in your teeth but was nutritious, and set it on the old toaster. The toaster was older than his relationship with time, older than his commitment to solitude. It had a single dial that you had to adjust by hand. No digital displays, no modern conveniences. He poured a glass of milk, measuring it the way he always did. His fingers wrapped precisely around the carton, tilting with a steadiness that looked almost surgical. He didn't notice it. He never did. Down the hall a small body stirred. The sound of sheets rustling, the soft padding of bare feet on hardwood. Marcus appeared in the kitchen doorway at exactly 6:12 a.m. 7 years old, wearing pajamas 2 sizes too big that Caleb had bought from the Goodwill downtown, hoping they'd last through the winter. The boy's eyes were still half closed, but his mouth was already open, already talking before his brain had fully awakened. "Dad, did you know the human heart beats over 100,000 times a day?" Marcus asked, dragging a book that was far too heavy for his small arms. Caleb set the plate on the table. The eggs were perfect, not too runny, not too firm. "Is that so?" he said. "Yeah, it says right here." Marcus climbed into the chair and flipped the book open. It was a thick, worn, hard cover with yellowed pages and medical illustrations that no 7-year-old should have been reading. He'd found it on the top shelf of the hallway closet 6 months ago, buried behind old blankets. Caleb had told him it was just some old book. Marcus had been reading it ever since, treating it like it was the most important text in the world. "And the aorta." Marcus continued, his voice carrying that particular enthusiasm only children possess when they're explaining something they find miraculous. "That's the biggest one. It's like this big." He held his hands apart about the width of a garden hose. "Eat your eggs," Caleb said quietly. "I'm just saying it's cool, Dad." Caleb watched his son shovel eggs into his mouth while turning pages with his free hand. Something tightened in his chest. Not pain exactly, something older than that. Something he had trained himself not to look at directly. The way you train yourself not to stare at the sun, because the brightness will burn your eyes if you do. He looked away. By 6:15 they were out the door. The road in front of their house wasn't paved. It was packed dirt that turned to mud when it rained and dust when it didn't. The houses on either side were spaced far apart, most of them just as worn, chain link fences everywhere. Trucks parked on dead lawns. This was the kind of town where nothing changed, and nobody asked why. People lived here because they couldn't afford to live anywhere else, or because they had given up on the idea that anywhere else would be better. The poverty here wasn't the kind that made news. It was the kind that was accepted as normal. The way you accept gravity or weather. Caleb walked Marcus to the bus stop at the end of the road. The morning air was heavy, carrying the smell of pine and old rain. Marcus walked beside him, still talking about blood cells, about how bones heal, about why people get fevers. The questions never stopped. His mind was a sponge that absorbed everything and wanted to understand the mechanism behind it all. "You know a lot," Caleb said quietly. "I read a lot," Marcus corrected. At the bus stop, Caleb knelt down and straightened Marcus's collar. It was a habit. Something his wife Lena used to do before school every morning. He didn't think about that either. "You be good today," he said. "I'm always good. Then keep it up." The bus came. Marcus climbed on. He turned. He waved once from the window and disappeared behind the dirty glass. Caleb stood there until the bus turned the corner, watching the space where his son had been, the way he watched that space every morning, as if he needed to confirm that Marcus had safely arrived at the next point in his day. Only then did he walk to work. The sawmill sat at the edge of town, a long metal building with open sides, the constant scream of blades cutting through timber. The sound was deafening, the kind of sound that entered your body and vibrated through your bones until you couldn't hear anything else. Which was exactly why Caleb liked it. It asked nothing of his mind. The work was loud, repetitive, physical. He operated the planer, feeding rough lumber through the machine, smoothing it flat. Precision work, but mindless. The exact combination he needed. The other men respected him. Not because he was friendly. He wasn't. He rarely spoke more than a few words. Never joined them for beers after shift. Never talked about where he came from or what he did before. But he showed up every day, never complained. And once, when old Ray Henderson sliced his palm open on a jagged plank, Caleb had wrapped the wound so quickly, so perfectly. The paramedic who arrived 20 minutes later said he'd never seen a cleaner field dressing. Nobody asked Caleb about that. He didn't offer an explanation. And that was how things worked in this town. You didn't ask, and people didn't tell. The weight of invisibility. After work, Caleb picked Marcus up from the after-school program at 3:47 p.m. The late afternoon light turned the dirt road golden. The kind of light that made everything look like it was dipped in honey. Marcus ran ahead, then circled back, then ran ahead again. A small orbit around his father, held in place by something invisible and unbreakable. At home they had a routine. Caleb would make dinner, usually rice and beans, sometimes chicken if it was on sale. Marcus would sit at the kitchen table doing homework or reading. After dinner they'd go outside. There was always something to fix. Tonight it was the fence. 3 boards had come loose in last week's wind. Caleb had picked up replacement planks from the mill. He held the board in place. Marcus handed him nails one at a time, like a nurse passing surgical instruments, though neither of them would have used that comparison. "Dad," Marcus said, handing him another nail. "Yeah." Marcus at school said his mom won't help our neighbor Miss Dolly carry her groceries because she's too busy. But Miss Dolly's got a bad knee. Caleb hammered the nail in with 2 precise strikes. "So what did you do?" he asked. "I carried them for her." Caleb looked down at his son. "Good. Yeah. Always help people when they need it, Marcus. That's what matters." He said it simply, like stating the weather. But his eyes held something heavier, as though the words were a debt he was still paying off. To someone who could no longer hear them. That someone had a name. But he didn't speak it anymore. Lena. Her name was Lena. The fence got fixed. They went inside. Marcus fell asleep with the medical book open on his chest. Caleb carried him to bed and pulled the blanket up. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching his son breathe, his chest rising and falling, still alive, still here. Then he walked to the kitchen, sat down at the table and stared at nothing. On the top shelf above the hallway closet behind a folded wool blanket sat a locked wooden box. Caleb hadn't opened it in 6 years. He didn't look at it. But every night sitting alone in the kitchen, he felt it, like a heartbeat in the walls of the house, steady and relentless, waiting. It contained everything he used to be: his surgical license, his credentials, his name in the medical journal, pictures of his wife. And underneath all of that, something he couldn't face, the weight of a choice he couldn't unmake. His hands rested flat on the table, long fingers, steady as stone. The hands of a man who could thread a needle in the dark. The hands of a surgeon who had once saved 43 people on the operating table. The hands of a man who had also failed one. Caleb closed his fists. Then he turned off the light and went to bed. The locked box, 6 years was a long time to hide. Caleb had become very good at it. Not hiding physically. He was visible every day at the sawmill, visible at the grocery store on Saturdays, visible at Marcus's school events, but invisible in the way that mattered. Invisible to himself, invisible to the person he used to be. That invisibility had become a comfort. It meant no one asked questions. It meant no one expected anything from him except that he show up, work, feed his son, maintain the routines. It meant he didn't have to remember the operating room, didn't have to remember the sound of the monitor flatline, didn't have to remember the look on the family's face when he walked out, when he told them he couldn't save her. But invisibility, he was learning, was not the same as peace. The house settled around him at night in the way old houses do, making creaking sounds like it was trying to communicate something. The leaking faucet in the bathroom dripped in a rhythm that had become hypnotic. Drip, 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 like a clock counting down to something he couldn't name. He sat in the darkness, not sleeping, not quite awake. In that space between consciousness where his guard dropped slightly, in that space he remembered things. He remembered Lena's laugh. He remembered the way she used to straighten Marcus's collar before school, the ritual he now performed, passing down a gesture that only he understood the weight of. He remembered the operating room, not the surgery. That part he could block out. But the moment after, the moment when he knew the choice he'd made in the OR was the wrong one. Not that it mattered now. The choice was made. It couldn't be unmade. Time moved only forward. That was 6 years ago. Now he sat in his kitchen in a small house on an unpaved road in a town that no one important would ever visit. And he tried not to think about the locked box on the top shelf. Tried not to think about who he had been. Tried not to think about the person who needed him, who had looked at him with desperate eyes and said, "Please, Dr. Morrison, you're the only one I trust with her life." He had been trusted, and he had failed. That was the weight he carried now. Not guilt exactly. Guilt was something you felt when you did something wrong. This was different. This was the weight of something true. He had not been good enough. And because he had not been good enough, someone had died. The solution was clear. Never operate again. Never be in a position where someone's life depended on him. Never stand in that operating room knowing that his hands, his decisions, his precision, all of it could fail. It was easier to work at the sawmill. It was easier to be invisible. It was easier to be someone no one expected anything from. Part 2. The intrusion, the storm. The storm came without warning. By 9 p.m. the sky had split open. Rain hammered the tin roof so hard it sounded like applause. Wind bent the trees sideways, the kind of wind that snapped branches and didn't care what got in its way. The power flickered twice, then gave up entirely. Caleb lit the kerosene lamp on the kitchen counter and checked on Marcus. Marcus slept through storms the way only children can, completely fearless. The boy hadn't even stirred when the lights went out. That was the thing about being 7 years old. The world was still mostly good. Sleep came easy. At 10:30 p.m., someone knocked on the door. Caleb stood still. No one came to this road at night. No one came to this road at all, really, unless they were lost. He waited. Sometimes people made mistakes. Sometimes they realized they were going the wrong direction and turned around. The knock came again, harder. Not the tentative knock of someone lost, but the knock of someone desperate. He opened the door. A woman stood in the rain. She was soaked, hair plastered to her face, clothes torn at the shoulder, one shoe missing. Her car was barely visible through the downpour. It sat at an angle in the ditch about 50 yards down the road. Its hazard lights blinked weakly against the storm, like a prayer that wasn't being answered. "Please," she said, that was all. Caleb stepped aside. He didn't ask her name, didn't ask where she was going or where she came from. He handed her a towel, then a dry blanket from the linen closet. He sat her at the kitchen table and made tea without asking if she wanted it. The woman was in her early 40s, he guessed. Sharp cheekbones, sharp eyes, even wet and exhausted. The kind of beautiful that made you angry. Because it seemed unfair that someone could look that way. Like they'd been assembled by someone who understood the mathematics of attractiveness. She wore the remnants of expensive clothing. A watch that cost more than Caleb made in a year. A blazer that was torn but still carried the weight of quality. Jewelry that had fallen to the bottom of the ditch and been abandoned. She sat at his table wrapped in the blanket and didn't speak. Caleb didn't push her too. The storm raged outside. The kerosene lamp flickered between them. And for the first time in 6 years, Caleb Morrison looked at another human being and saw not an obligation or a responsibility, but simply a person in need. That was dangerous. The woman's arrival. She stayed the night. Caleb set up the guest room, a room that had never been used because he never had guests. He found clean sheets, made the bed, showed her where everything was. She thanked him with very few words. She seemed to prefer silence the way he did. By morning, the storm had passed. The sun came up over the dirt road and made everything look clean, the way storms do. The woman came into the kitchen at 7:15 a.m., showered and dressed in clean clothes Caleb had left out for her. She looked different without the mud and rain. Not better. Worse, maybe. More real. The exhaustion underneath became visible, the dark circles under her eyes. They suggested she hadn't slept well in months, maybe years. Marcus came in seconds later. He stopped, looked at the stranger in the kitchen with the frank curiosity only children possess, and asked, "Who are you?" The woman smiled. "I had a car accident. Your father helped me. Are you okay? I will be. Thank you for asking." Marcus climbed into his chair and started talking about his medical book, the way he always did. The woman and Caleb still didn't know her name watched the interaction between father and son with an intensity that suggested she was taking notes, cataloging something. She watched how Caleb listened to Marcus, how he answered his questions with patience, how love moved between them, silently, without performance. Caleb made eggs, set them on the table, poured juice, went through the morning routines as if an unexpected guest was a normal occurrence, which it wasn't. By afternoon, her car had been retrieved. A truck had come, driven by someone Caleb didn't recognize, someone who moved with the efficiency of someone paid well to move efficiently. The woman watched from the porch as her vehicle was hauled out of the ditch and set on the road. She didn't get in it. Instead, she came back inside. "I need to stay a little longer," she said. "My car needs repairs and I'm not ready to drive yet." Caleb nodded like this was expected. "The guest room is prepared." She stayed for 3 days. During those 3 days, Caleb realized something uncomfortable. He was becoming aware of her. Not in a romantic way exactly, but in the way you become aware of another presence in your space. The way her footsteps sounded on the hardwood floor. The way she made tea in the morning before he woke up. The way she sat on the porch and stared at nothing. The same way he did. Marcus seemed to like her. He showed her his medical book. She asked him intelligent questions about the illustrations. She didn't talk down to him or praise him excessively. She just treated him like a person, which was rarer than it should have been. On the third night, sitting at the dinner table after Marcus had gone to bed, the woman finally spoke about herself. "My name is Victoria Ashford," she said, "and I've been looking for you for 6 months." The morning after, Caleb didn't sleep that night. He sat in the kitchen after Victoria went to bed, turning over her words, looking for him for 6 months, which meant she knew who he was, which meant his invisibility was over. The realization brought both relief and terror in equal measure. Part of him, the part that had wanted to disappear, had succeeded. He had hidden so completely. That being found was almost a mercy, like a tumor finally being detected. But another part of him, the part he'd successfully suppressed for 6 years, woke up at the sound of those words. By morning, Victoria was packing. "I have to go," she said at breakfast. "Thank you for letting me stay." Caleb wanted to ask questions. He didn't. He just nodded and helped her get her things together. But at the doorway she stopped. "Your son," she said. "He's remarkable. He gets it from his mother," Caleb said. Victoria paused, processing this information. "And where is his mother?" Caleb didn't answer. He just closed the door and watched her car disappear down the dirt road, taking with her the brief interruption in his solitude. But her presence remained. That night, sitting alone in the kitchen again, Caleb couldn't stop thinking about her words, looking for him, for 6 months. She hadn't come by accident. The storm hadn't been luck. She had been searching, deliberately and systematically, until she found him, which meant she wanted something. And when people wanted something from you, they took it, regardless of whether you were willing to give it. Part 3. The revelation, the kitchen conversation. She came back 3 days later. No warning, no phone call, just a car turning onto the dirt road at dusk. And Victoria stepping out with a briefcase and a determination that suggested she had made a decision and wasn't interested in debate. She was wearing a different blazer now. This one was clearly expensive, tailored to her body in a way that screamed wealth. Her hair was down. Her makeup was perfect. She looked nothing like the woman who had sat in his kitchen wrapped in a blanket. "I told you I was looking for you," she said without preamble. "I didn't tell you why." Caleb let her in. Marcus was in bed. The house was quiet except for the sound of the kitchen clock, a battery-operated one that ticked with metronome precision. "My father is dying," Victoria said, sitting at the kitchen table without waiting to be invited. "Pancreatic cancer stage 4. He's been hospitalized for 3 months, and every specialist in the country has told me the same thing. Surgery is his only chance, and even then survival rates are poor, 40% at best." Caleb listened. "6 months ago, I hired an investigator to find someone specific," Victoria continued. "A surgeon. Someone who had disappeared 6 years ago from Johns Hopkins. Someone who had a reputation for precision, for never losing a patient on the operating table. I spent months pulling sealed files, working with lawyers, using every resource I had access to." She paused. "I found you working at a sawmill in rural Georgia, raising a 7-year-old son alone, living as if you'd decided the world ended 6 years ago." Victoria Caleb started. "My father is Richard Ashford," she continued, as if he hadn't spoken. "He's 72 years old. He built a company that's worth $80 billion, and 3 weeks ago he told me something. He said that you performed surgery on a woman named Lena Morrison, that you were married to her, that she died on the operating table." and that you've spent the last 6 years deciding it was your fault. The name landed in the room like a stone dropped in still water, creating ripples that touched every wall. How do you know that Caleb's voice was barely a whisper? Because I read the sealed files. Because I talked to her family. Because I understand what it costs to lose someone, and then spend years running from that loss. Victoria leaned forward. My mother died giving birth to me. The doctors did everything right. She died anyway. My father spent 10 years angry at the universe. Then he spent another 10 realizing that survival without meaning is just a long, slow death. She pulled out her tablet and turned it to show him a video. A man's face, older, weathered, but with kind eyes. Richard Ashford. Caleb, the recording began. I don't know if you'll forgive yourself, but I forgive you. My friend's daughter was your patient. She was brave. She chose you because she trusted you with her life. And even though it ended the way it ended, that trust was real. That choice was real. What wasn't real was the idea that you were responsible for keeping her alive. Sometimes people die. That's not failure. That's mortality. The video stopped. Caleb couldn't breathe. He wants you to operate on him, Victoria said quietly. Not because he's my father, but because he says you're the only surgeon he's ever read about who operates from the heart instead of the ego. He says he'd rather die trying than live afraid. I can't, Caleb said. You can, you just won't. Those aren't different things. They're completely different things, Victoria said. One is about ability, the other is about choice. She stood to leave. At the door she turned back. I'll be at the Oakwood Hotel in town, room 307. I'm flying to Johns Hopkins tomorrow to arrange for the surgical team. If you decide you want to say goodbye to your son before leaving, I can arrange that. She left, and Caleb sat in the kitchen for 7 hours, staring at the locked box on the shelf, listening to the clock tick, feeling his entire carefully constructed life begin to crack like glass under pressure. Caleb's internal war. He didn't sleep. He sat in Marcus's room watching his son breathe, the way he did every night. But tonight it felt different. Tonight felt like goodbye. His hands were shaking after 6 years of absolute control, of keeping his emotions locked away, as securely as his credentials. His hands were shaking because he understood what Victoria was asking. She was asking him to step back into the room where he had failed, to hold another person's life in his hands, to make decisions that could end in death. The rational part of his brain, the part that had kept him alive these past 6 years, said no. Said stay here, stay safe, stay invisible. But another part of him, the part that had become a surgeon in the first place, was waking up. And it was hungry. By 4:45 a.m., his usual waking time, Caleb had made a decision. He didn't know if it was the right one. He only knew it was the inevitable one. He called Marcus's teacher. He called Dr. Patterson at the clinic. He called Victoria. I'll come, he said. How soon, Victoria asked, and he could hear the relief in her voice, as if she'd been holding her breath for hours. Tomorrow. I need to arrange care for Marcus. Already done. I've hired a full-time caregiver. She'll be there at 8 a.m. Of course she had. That afternoon when Marcus came home from school, Caleb sat him down at the kitchen table. I have to go away for a little while, he said. Marcus's face changed. We're a hospital. To help someone like I used to do before I worked at the mill. Will you come back? Yes, promise. Caleb looked at his son and made a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. Promise. Victoria's return. Victoria arrived early morning with a rental car and documents. She didn't ask questions about his decision. She simply treated it as fact. Moving forward with the logistics. A flight was arranged. A hotel room was booked. His credentials were being fast-tracked through Johns Hopkins Hospital administration. Everything was proceeding with the kind of efficiency that only significant money could purchase. Before they left, Victoria did something unexpected. She asked to meet Marcus. I want him to know this isn't an abandonment, she said. I want him to know his father is saving someone, that he's a hero. Caleb didn't correct her use of the word hero. He just arranged it. Victoria came into the kitchen where Marcus was eating breakfast. She sat down across from him, and something shifted in the way she held her body. She became less CEO and more human. Your father is going to do something very important, she told Marcus. He's going to operate on my father. That means he's going to use his skills to try to save someone's life. It's going to be hard. It's going to scare him. But he's going to do it anyway. Is your dad going to die? Marcus asked with the kind of brutal honesty only children possessed. Maybe, but not without someone trying to save him first. That's what your father does. He tries, and sometimes trying is all we have. Marcus nodded like this made perfect sense. Will you take care of him? Marcus asked. While Dad is scared, Victoria paused. Then, yes, I will. And Caleb understood watching them across the table that this woman had just made a promise she would have to keep. Not because Marcus had forced her to, but because Marcus had given her permission to care about his father. Part 4, The Hospital. The first conversation, Johns Hopkins Hospital, was exactly as Caleb remembered it. The hallways were bright and sterile. The equipment was modern. Everything was designed to save lives, though the equipment itself remained indifferent to the suffering it witnessed every day. The hospital didn't care. It was just a building. What mattered was what happened inside the building. Victoria led him to a private consultation room where his credentials were waiting for him. His license, which had expired 6 years ago, was being reinstated through an emergency process that required only the hospital director's approval. The approval had come through in less than an hour. We have connections, Victoria had said, as if this explained everything. Richard Ashford was in the ICU. But before Caleb saw him, Victoria wanted to talk. She closed the consultation room door and turned to face him directly. Before you operate, she said, you need to understand what I'm asking of you. I'm not asking you to save my father because he's my father. I'm asking you to operate because you're the only surgeon I believe can do this with the care it requires. Because your hands remember even if your mind is trying to forget. Because you're the kind of person who operates from compassion instead of ambition. That's not true, Caleb said. I'm a coward. I ran instead of facing what happened. Yes. And now you're facing it. That's not cowardice. That's the opposite of cowardice. She pulled out her tablet and showed him something. A photograph. A woman in a hospital gown smiling at the camera despite the IV in her arm. Lena Morrison. This is her, Victoria asked. Caleb couldn't speak. She was your patient. She was my father's friend's daughter. She chose you to operate on her because she trusted you. Even knowing the risks, even knowing the statistics, she chose your hands over everyone else's. Victoria paused. That trust was real. Her choice was real. The fact that she died doesn't erase that. She turned the tablet away. I also want to tell you something about myself, Victoria continued. I didn't have to search 6 months to find you. With my resources, I could have found you in 6 weeks, but I delayed because I was afraid. I've spent my entire life controlling everything around me because I'm terrified of the moment when I can't control anything. When someone I love gets hurt and I can't fix it. She paused. So I understand what you're running from. I've just chosen a different direction to run. Caleb understood then. This woman wasn't a stranger who had crashed on his road. She was a mirror, a reflection of his own fear, dressed in a different kind of armor. Your father, he said, the tumor location. It's in the retroperitoneum. Yes, attached to the celiac artery and the superior mesenteric artery. The surgeons say it's inoperable. They mean they won't try. You would try. And if I fail, then at least you tried. At least he'll know he didn't die without someone giving everything to save him. Caleb turned to look out the window. Below, the city moved on, indifferent to the life and death dramas playing out in the hospital. People went to work. Children went to school. The world continued. "I'll operate," he said. Victoria released a breath she'd been holding. The research scene. That night, Caleb couldn't sleep. He sat in the hotel room Victoria had arranged for him. Too expensive. Too nice. Everything about it screaming wealth. And he reviewed the surgical files. Richard Ashford's scans. The imaging. The lab work. The tumor, which was large and aggressive, had wrapped itself around blood vessels like a parasite that had claimed him from the inside. The surgery would be 8 hours minimum, possibly more. The blood loss could be catastrophic. The possibility of arterial rupture was high. The survival rate was realistically 30%. But none of those things mattered compared to one fact. Richard Ashford had requested him. A man Caleb had never met was lying in this hospital, waiting to have his abdomen opened by a surgeon who had been too afraid to operate for 6 years. In the next room, Victoria was awake too. Caleb knew because at 3:15 a.m. she knocked on his door. "I can't sleep," she said. He let her in. They didn't talk for a while. They just sat together in the darkness, two people carrying different kinds of fear, understanding each other without words. Finally, Victoria spoke. "My father made his fortune in real estate development," she said. "He built buildings. Sometimes those buildings displaced people who had been living there for generations. I never questioned it because it was normal business. But last year my father started questioning it. He started giving away money, not in small amounts, billions, to people who had been displaced, to communities that had been damaged by his development, to healthcare initiatives." She paused. He was trying to make amends. I asked him why at his age it suddenly mattered. He said, "Because I understand finally that power without compassion is just destruction that gets documented." He said he'd spent his life building things. But what he wanted to be remembered for was building people up, not tearing them down. "Is that why he wanted me?" Caleb asked. He said that when he read about your case, he understood something. He understood that a surgeon who operates from love instead of ego is the kind of person who would understand that buildings don't matter as much as the people inside them. They sat in silence. "I'm terrified," Victoria said finally. "So am I," Caleb admitted. "What are you afraid of? That I'll fail? That my hands will remember wrong? That I'll lose him the way I lost Lena?" Victoria turned to look at him. "And what if you don't fail? What if your hands remember perfectly? What then?" "Then I have to accept that sometimes medicine works, that sometimes we survive, that sometimes the ending is okay. Would that be so terrible?" Caleb didn't answer, but he reached over and took her hand. They sat like that until dawn, neither of them sleeping, both of them afraid, both of them waiting for the moment that would either redeem them or break them completely. The pre-surgery moment. The night before surgery, Caleb stood at the window of the hospital hallway and stared down at the parking lot below. He was in surgical scrubs, though surgery wasn't until morning. He changed into them at midnight because wearing them felt like a form of honesty, acknowledging that he was becoming a surgeon again, not just a man hiding in a small town. His hands were shaking again. He didn't hear her approach, but suddenly Victoria was standing beside him, also in scrubs, also unable to sleep, also terrified. "Your father?" Caleb asked, sedated, trying to rest before the procedure. "How scared is he?" "Less scared than I am." They stood in silence. "What if something goes wrong?" Victoria asked quietly. "Something will go wrong," Caleb said. "It always does. The question is whether I can adapt when it does. Can you?" Caleb didn't answer immediately. He thought about his hands, about the surgery he'd performed on Lena, about the moment when her heart stopped, and he realized that despite everything he knew, despite all his skill, mortality was stronger than medicine. "Yes," he said finally, "I can. I've spent 6 years accepting failure. Somehow I've become very good at it." Victoria turned to face him. I want to tell you something. Not as the CEO of Ashford Capital, but as the daughter of a man who's about to have his body opened by a surgeon who's terrified. I want to tell you that I've been researching you for 6 months, and in all that research, in all the files and documents and sealed medical records, I found one constant. Every single patient you ever operated on loved you, not respected you, loved you because you didn't just operate on their bodies, you operated with the understanding that those bodies belonged to people. That those people mattered, that their lives were sacred. She paused. My father knows this. He's not afraid of your skill, Caleb. He's afraid of dying without someone who understands that, someone who operates from the heart instead of the ego. Caleb felt something break open in his chest. After the surgery, he said, regardless of what happens after, we figure it out. For now, I just need you to remember why you became a surgeon in the first place, not because you were special, but because saving people mattered to you. She reached out and took his hand. They stood like that, at a hospital window in the middle of the night. Two people from completely different worlds, connected by nothing except the understanding that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let someone else help you carry the weight. Part 5. The surgery. Entering the operating room. The OR was cathedral quiet. Caleb stood in his surgical scrubs, mask in place, hands scrubbed with the ritual precision he remembered from his old life. The surgical staff was arranged around him, nurses he'd never met, an anesthesiologist he'd never worked with, an assisting surgeon who kept watching him like he was about to spontaneously combust. In the pre-op area, Richard Ashford lay on the surgical table, sedated, his body already being prepared for the violation that was necessary for healing. Caleb looked at the man's face. He saw the kindness that Victoria had described. He saw the trust, even in unconsciousness. Then he turned to the surgical field and made the first incision. His hands were steady. The scalpel moved through flesh with the kind of precision that comes from muscle memory so deep it becomes instinct. His hands knew this, even after 6 years. Even after telling himself he'd forgotten. His hands remembered exactly what to do. The incision was perfect. The bleeding was minimal. The exposure was clean. In the gallery above, Victoria stood perfectly still, barely breathing. She watched Caleb work and realized something. This man wasn't just a surgeon performing a procedure. He was a surgeon making love visible. Every movement was deliberate. Every decision was made with the care of someone who understood that he was holding a human life in his hands. She watched him find the tumor. She watched him trace the boundaries of where it had invaded Richard's body. She watched him understand the architecture of the invasion, where it was attached, where it was vulnerable, where the blood vessels were at risk. She understood why her father had insisted on him. This man operated from the heart. You could see it in every movement. The crisis moment. 2 hours into the surgery, the tumor was proving more complex than the scans had suggested. The arterial involvement was deeper than expected. The adhesions were more extensive. What should have been a straightforward resection was becoming a complex reconstruction. Caleb adapted. He didn't panic, he didn't call for additional help, though it would have been reasonable to do so. Instead, his hands moved into the field with the kind of unhurried precision that suggested he wasn't in a hospital at all. But in his own mind, in a space where time moved at the speed of thought, and his hands simply executed what his intellect decided, he found new angles. He adjusted his approach. He saw the tumor not as an invader to be conquered, but as a problem to be solved with precision and care. Then suddenly bleeding. One of the adhesions had torn, causing a small branch of the celiac artery to rupture. Blood began to pool in the surgical field. The monitors picked it up. Heart rate accelerating, blood pressure dropping, oxygen saturation declining. Pressure is dropping, the anesthesiologist said. I see it, Caleb said calmly. In the gallery, Victoria's entire body went rigid. Caleb's hands moved. Not quickly, not frantically, but with the kind of certainty that suggests complete control. He found the bleeder, found the exact point where the arterial wall had torn, used vascular clamps to control the bleeding, pressure stabilizing, the anesthesiologist said. The monitors began to climb back toward normal. Caleb didn't celebrate. He didn't pause. He simply continued, his hands moving into the retroperitoneum, finding the vessel, repairing it with meticulous sutures, each one placed with the care of someone who understood that this man's life depended on his precision. By the time he finished the repair, Victoria understood something she hadn't understood before. Caleb Morrison wasn't operating on Richard Ashford. He was operating on Lena Morrison. Finally making the choice he couldn't make 6 years ago. Finally using his skill to save someone when it mattered most. The eye contact moment. The tumor came out whole at 5:47 p.m. Not fragmented, not compromised. Whole. The dark, ugly mass that had been killing Richard Ashford from the inside was suddenly freed from his body, suddenly visible, suddenly defeated. Caleb held it for a moment, understanding the weight of it, not just physically, but metaphorically. This tumor represented the mortality he couldn't control, the failure he couldn't prevent, the loss he couldn't escape. He set it in the specimen tray and continued. The vascular repair was verified. The abdominal wall was being closed. The surgery was transitioning from the acute crisis phase to the systematic closure phase. Caleb stepped back from the operating table for exactly 2 seconds. He looked up at the gallery window. Victoria was standing at the glass, directly across from him. Their eyes met for exactly as long as it took for him to understand that she'd been watching the entire procedure, that she'd witnessed him being exactly who he needed to be, that she'd seen him stop running and start fighting. He nodded once. She nodded back. Then he turned and continued closing. Patient is stable, the anesthesiologist announced. Vitals normalizing. We're going to make it. They were going to make it. Richard Ashford was going to survive. And Caleb Morrison was going to have to accept that he was a good enough surgeon to save lives. That his hands were trustworthy. That the past, while real, didn't have to define the future. Part 6. The aftermath. The week after surgery, Richard Ashford woke up on the second day. He was groggy, in pain, attached to more tubes than a human being should reasonably be able to tolerate. But he was alive. The monitors confirmed it. The lab work confirmed it. The fact that he was able to squeeze Victoria's hand confirmed it. The first thing he asked was, did he forgive himself? Victoria paused. Understanding that her father, even sedated and drugged and in pain, was asking about something deeper than post-operative survival. I think so, she said. Caleb spent 3 days at Johns Hopkins Hospital monitoring Richard's recovery. The surgery had been successful. The complications were minimal. The prognosis was optimistic. The old man who had requested this procedure was going to recover and resume his life. But Caleb was done. On the 4th day, he made a decision. He walked into the hospital director's office and informed them that he would not be rejoining Johns Hopkins' surgical program. He wouldn't be accepting any of the offers that were already flooding in. Other hospitals, lecture circuits, consulting firms, speaking engagements, books about his return from exile. Instead, he was going back to rural Georgia, to the small clinic with the leaking roof and the overworked doctor, to the town where nobody asked questions. To Marcus, who was waiting, who had been promised that his father would return. Victoria didn't try to stop him. She just organized his travel and drove him to the airport. What will you do? She asked as his flight was being called. Practice medicine the way it's supposed to be practiced, he said. Helping people who can't pay for it, showing up for community that has been invisible to the healthcare system. Raising my son and us, Victoria asked quietly. That's your choice, Caleb said. I can't promise you anything except that I'm not running anymore. Whatever happens with us, friendship, nothing, something I can't name yet, it will be real. It won't be you trying to save me, and I won't be trying to disappear. We'll just be two people trying to figure out how to live. Victoria nodded. "I think I'd like that," she said. Victoria's transformation. Victoria went back to her office. Everything was different. She sat at her desk looking at the acquisition proposals, the development plans, the quarterly projections, and something had fundamentally shifted in her. She found herself asking questions she'd never asked before. Who is being displaced? Who benefits? What is the cost to people who have nothing? For 41 years, she'd built an empire by controlling everything, by using power as a shield against vulnerability, by making decisions based on profit margins instead of human impact. Now she made different decisions. She redirected charitable giving to healthcare initiatives. She established a fund to support communities displaced by Ashford Capital's development. She began the slow process of dismantling the armor she'd spent her entire life constructing. Her board questioned her. Her advisors suggested she was having a midlife crisis. Her accountants warned her that she was reducing profitability. She didn't care, because she'd watched a man who had been broken by one loss, who had been hidden by fear, who had been invisible to the world, choose to step back into the pain because someone asked him to. She'd watched him make that choice not because he was heroic, but because he was human. Because humans are capable of bravery when they decide that the alternative, staying broken, is worse than stepping forward. 3 weeks after Caleb left, Victoria took a leave of absence from her CEO position. She drove to rural Georgia in a rental car that cost a tenth of what her usual vehicle cost. She drove to the small clinic with the leaking roof, and she walked in to find Caleb Morrison treating a patient, an elderly woman with arthritis and no insurance. Someone the system had left behind. He looked up when she came in. "Hi," he said simply. "Hi," she said back, "want to help?" And that's how Victoria Ashford, billionaire CEO of an $80 billion corporation, learned to take a blood pressure reading. How she learned that helping people didn't require controlling them. How she learned that medicine was supposed to be about service, not status. The choice to stay 3 months later. Victoria was still there. Not full-time, not yet, but more than temporary. She had restructured her schedule so that she spent most weeks in the small town, overseeing Ashford Capital from a distance, making decisions that would have shocked her board members a year ago. The clinic had been expanded, funded by her generosity, but run according to Dr. Patterson's vision. A new surgical wing was being constructed, not for complex procedures, but for the kind of medicine that served the people who had been invisible to the healthcare system for generations. Caleb worked there every morning before heading to the sawmill. He'd kept his job, though now he did it 3 days a week instead of 5. The work kept him grounded. The money wasn't significant, but the balance was. Marcus had adjusted. He came home from school now to find Victoria sometimes, reading medical textbooks alongside him, asking questions that showed she genuinely wanted to understand. She never tried to be his mother. She just tried to be present. One evening, sitting on the porch of Caleb's house, the same porch where the fence had finally stopped leaning, because they'd all worked together to fix it, Victoria asked him something. "Do you think we would have met if I hadn't crashed into that ditch?" Caleb smiled. A real smile, not restrained. "I think we would have eventually. The universe has a way of bringing together the people who need each other." "Is that what we are?" Victoria asked. "People who need each other, I think so," Caleb said. "I think I needed someone to remind me that hiding isn't the same as healing. And I think you needed someone to remind you that power without connection is just a very elaborate form of loneliness." Marcus ran out of the house holding his anatomy book. "Dad, Miss Victoria, look at this! It shows how the heart repairs itself after damage." He held up the picture, excited, unable to contain the joy of learning something that connected to what he had witnessed his father do. Caleb pulled his son onto his lap. Victoria leaned closer to look, and for the first time in a long time, both of them stopped trying to control the future and just existed in the present. 3 people, 1 small house, no performance, just being. Part 7. The resolution. 3 months later. The dirt road was still unpaved. The houses were still worn. The town was still poor. The systems that had created the poverty were still in place. But something had shifted. Small, quiet, real. Miss Dolly's house had a new ramp that made it easier for her to navigate with her bad knee. The clinic had new equipment. The school had a better after-school program funded through Victoria's healthcare initiative. These were small changes in a large system. But they were changes driven by someone who had understood finally that power was supposed to serve people, not dominate them. Richard Ashford visited from the city. He was recovered, fully functional, grateful in the way of someone who had been given a second chance. He walked through the clinic with Caleb, saw the patients, understood what his daughter was building. "You're becoming the man I always thought you should be," Richard told his daughter. "I'm becoming myself," Victoria corrected. "I just needed help to remember who that was supposed to be." The justice element. The news broke quietly, the way major corruption often does, not with drama, but with documentation and legal filing. An investigation into Ashford Capital's financial records had uncovered mismanagement and outright fraud orchestrated by Douglas Crawford, a board member who had been embezzling funds and misrepresenting corporate assets for years. The investigation had been initiated by Richard Ashford himself, who had discovered the fraud through an internal audit. Crawford was arrested. The case went to trial. The evidence was overwhelming. He received a 15-year prison sentence for fraud, embezzlement, and breach of fiduciary duty. It was justice served through the legal system. Imperfect, slow but real. Caleb read about it in the local news and understood something. The world was broken in fundamental ways. You couldn't fix it by being invisible. You fixed it by being visible, by using whatever power you had to help people, by refusing to participate in the systems that harmed them. Victoria had learned this too, that her wealth, which she couldn't escape, could be a weapon against injustice instead of in its service. The final scene, sunset on the porch. Caleb, Marcus, and Victoria sitting together. Nothing fancy, nothing performed. Just 3 people in the ordinary moment of ending the day. Marcus pointed. "The fence finally doesn't lean." Victoria smiled. "Because he fixed it." Marcus shook his head. "No, because we all held it while he worked." The boy was wise in the way of children who have watched adults be brave. He understood something that took most people lifetimes to learn. That alone we are fragile. Together we are strong. Caleb's hand rested next to Victoria's, not holding, but close enough. A promise that wasn't dramatic, just real. He thought I stopped running. I stopped hiding. I stopped thinking that love was something I didn't deserve. Victoria thought I spent my life controlling everything. I learned control means nothing without connection. Marcus thought Dad smiles now. Miss Victoria stays. We're a family. The sky turned purple, then blue, then black. The stars came out, the way they do in places far enough from the city that darkness still exists. Sometimes the biggest revolutions happen in small towns, on unpaved roads, between people who decide that survival isn't enough. They choose to live. They choose to be visible. They choose to help each other carry the weight. That's what the story is about. Not about a poor man who was saved by a rich woman, but about 2 broken people who found each other in a storm and decided that healing wasn't about forgetting the past. It was about integrating it, about letting it teach them something, about becoming the people they were meant to be when they stopped running. Outro. If this story touched something in you, if you've ever felt like you had to hide who you are, or if you know what it means to carry something heavy and still keep going, leave a comment, tell your story. because we're all carrying weight, we're all scared, we're all wondering if the thing we're running from is bigger than the thing we're running toward. But sometimes someone comes along who sees you, really sees you, not the armor you've built, not the invisibility you've created, but the real person underneath. And sometimes that's enough to help you stop running. If you haven't already, subscribe our channel, because every week we bring you stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things, about second chances, about the moments that remind us who we really are when we finally stop running from it. I'll see you in the next.